Hello biology students, and welcome to video 2 in the respiratory system unit. So in this unit we're going to be talking about many things, the first of which is breathing and how breathing works. So first I want to point out that breathing can be broken down into two parts: inhalation, which is bringing air into the lungs, and exhalation, which is breathing air out of the lungs. So let's start with inhalation first. So first, in inhalation, the first thing that happens is your diaphragm contracts. Now remember, the diaphragm is a muscle that kind of cuts your body in half. It's right here. It's this orange thing in this picture. And as it contracts, it moves down. So it's going to move down in this direction. And if you can kind of imagine, that would make more space in your chest cavity. So it expands your chest cavity, makes your chest cavity bigger. At the same time, the rib muscles contract, and they move outward, again, making the chest cavity bigger. Now, because there's the same amount of air in the chest cavity, and the chest cavity is now bigger, you're basically going to have a negative pressure. Okay, in other words, the increase in volume of your chest cavity or in lung volume causes air to want to move in because there's more space for more air particles. Okay, so you're going to get diffusion of air into the lungs, flowing from an air of high pressure, which is kind of outside the body, to lower pressure, which is inside the body. And then in exhalation, the exact opposite thing is going to happen. Your rib muscles and your diaphragm are both going to relax, which is going to make the chest cavity smaller. The volume of the rib cage and the chest cavity decreases, so now there's air in a smaller space, so now you have a higher pressure inside your alveoli, inside the lungs, and therefore air is going to be forced out to the atmosphere where there's a lower pressure. So again, let's summarize that a little bit in a chart. So during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, it moves down, and your rib cage expands, so air is going to go now in because there's lower pressure inside the lungs. And when you exhale, your diaphragm moves upward, it relaxes, your rib muscles move in to make the chest cavity smaller, so air rushes out of the lungs. So as we breathe in and out, the maximum volume of air that we can inhale and exhale is called our vital capacity. However, we don't exhale all the air in our lungs at any given time. So the alveoli aren't completely emptied of their air, because otherwise the lungs would collapse. So our lungs can actually hold more air than our vital capacity, and there's kind of a residual volume of dead air that remains in the lungs even after you exhale. Okay? So the vital capacity for a female, so females can breathe in and out about 3.4 liters of air, and males 4.8 liters of air. And this is at the college age, so kind of you can assume people to be fully grown. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about what controls breathing, kind of like how do we know when to breathe faster, how do we know when to breathe slower. So there are two control centers in the brain that regulate breathing. There are parts of the brain called the pons and the medulla oblongata, which is kind of fun to say. Basically what happens is the medulla oblongata, or the medulla, tells the ribs and the diaphragm when to contract. And a normal breathing rate happens between 10 and 14 times a minute. And there are also control centers in the blood that monitor the level of CO2. And kind of the idea is if there's lots of CO2 in the blood, these control centers are going to tell the brain, hey, we have to breathe faster because we need more oxygen. And if the CO2 levels are relatively low, these centers tell the brain, hey, we can breathe slower because we have plenty of oxygen. And it is interesting. They do monitor CO2. They don't monitor oxygen directly. Instead, they monitor carbon dioxide. So let me give you an example. So if you're vigorously exercising, that means you're going to have an increased metabolism. Your cells are going to be doing lots of cell respiration to make ATP. So therefore, because you're doing lots of cell respiration, you're going to have lots of CO2 in the blood. CO2 and water are going to combine to make carbonic acid. We've seen that several times already this year. And that's going to make, if I have lots of acid around, that's going to make the pH of the blood go down, right? Because acid has a low pH. The sensors in your blood and the medulla are going to sense that pH drop. And the brain's going to say, hey, if it's really acidic, that means lots of carbon dioxide around, so I better increase my breathing rate to get get rid of this CO2 and to get more oxygen. Now more CO2 is released, more oxygen is brought in, and the pH levels will return to normal. That's kind of one example of how this process works. So in addition to the brain centers that I just talked about in the last couple of slides that monitor CO2, you also have sensors in your aorta and your carotid artery that monitor both oxygen and carbon dioxide. And basically the idea is here, if oxygen is really low, these nerves signal your brain to tell you you better breathe faster. So this one's a little more, we're not going to go into it as in depth as we did the other one. So let's look at these pictures here to put some of this stuff together. So during inhalation, we're going to breathe in air, which is mainly going to be oxygen. That oxygen is going to diffuse into the bloodstream, be pumped around the body, and eventually that oxygen is going to be used by cells for cellular respiration. When the cells use the oxygen for cellular respiration, they're going to release CO2 back into the blood. That CO2 is going to travel around the body where it is going to be released during exhalation. And our brain and the different sensors in our arteries are going to monitor the blood for CO2 and oxygen levels to make sure we are breathing, inhaling, and exhaling at the proper rate. Okay, so the next thing I want to discuss is hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a protein that I know we've heard of. It's found in red blood cells, okay? And this is the protein that transports gases, so oxygen, in the blood. And in fact, most of the oxygen in the blood is carried by hemoglobin. So if you talk about hemoglobin in a little bit more detail, hemoglobin has quaternary structure, so it's made up of 4 polypeptide chains, okay? And in each polypeptide, there's a chemical group called a heme in the middle, hence the name hemoglobin. And that heme group is where the iron atom sits. You might have heard that, people might have either low or high iron in the blood. Well, this is important because the iron and the hemoglobin is actually what carries the oxygen, okay? And because hemoglobin has 4 hemes for its 4 polypeptide chains, it can carry 4 oxygen molecules at any time. So if you have low iron, the reason that's a problem, because without the iron atom in your heme, you're going to have a hard time carrying oxygen. So if we look at the way hemoglobin works, hemoglobin can actually carry carbon dioxide and water. So if we talk about carbon dioxide transport, carbon dioxide will enter red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide will bind to hemoglobin. That's kind of one way hemoglobin can carry CO2. However, some of the CO2 reacts with water in the red blood cell and forms carbonic acid, and it will be transported as carbonic acid. Okay? And then, interestingly, that carbonic acid can break apart into high H+ and bicarbonate ions, and that is actually what contributes to the acidicness of carbonic acid. Because remember, acids release H+. We talked about the acidness of carbonic acid a little bit earlier in the video. Okay, so because we don't want our blood to be super acidic, because we're going to have some CO2 in our blood, hemoglobin is going to bind most of that H+ in addition to the CO2 to help minimize the change in blood pH. And then some of those bicarbonate ions, the other half of the carbonic acid, will diffuse into the plasma of the red blood cell where they're carried to the lungs there. And then in the lungs, that process is reversed. So the H+ will recombine with the bicarbonate ion, and that will break into CO2 and water. So the CO2 can be released into the lungs to be exhaled out of the body. Okay. So if you look at a picture here, here I have a red blood cell. So you can see some carbon dioxide binds right to my heme group, but some carbon dioxide will form carbonic acid when it combines with water, and it will form that bicarbonate ion and an H+. And the H+ will bind to the hemoglobin as well, and the bicarbonate ion will be transferred in the plasma of the blood.